The League of Nations was an intergovernmental organization founded on 10 January 1920 as a result of the Paris Peace Conference that ended the First World War. It was the first international organization whose principal mission was to maintain world peace. Its primary goals, as stated in its covenant, included preventing wars through collective security and disarmament and settling international disputes through negotiation and arbitration. Other issues in this and related treaties included labor conditions, just treatment of native inhabitants, human and drug trafficking, the arms trade, global health, prisoners of war, and protection of minorities in Europe. At its greatest extent from the 28th of September 1934 to the 23rd of February 1935, it had 58 members. The diplomatic philosophy behind the League represented a fundamental shift from the preceding 100 years. The League lacked its own armed force and depended on the great powers to enforce its resolutions, keep to its economic sanctions, or provide an army when needed. However, the great powers were often reluctant to do so. Sanctions could hurt League members, so they were reluctant to comply with them. During the Second Italo-Abyssinian War, when the League accused Italian soldiers of targeting Red Cross medical tents, Benito Mussolini responded that the League is very well when sparrows shout, but no good at all when eagles fall out. After a number of notable successes and some early failures in the 1920s, the League ultimately proved incapable of preventing aggression by the Axis powers in the 1930s. Germany withdrew from the League, as did Japan, Italy, Spain, and others. The onset of the Second World War showed that the League had failed its primary purpose, which was to prevent any future world war. The League lasted for 26 years. The United Nations replaced it after the end of the Second World War on the 20th of April 1946 and inherited a number of agencies and organizations founded by the League. Origins. Background. The concept of a peaceful community of nations had been proposed as far back as 1795, when Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, outlined the idea of a League of Nations to control conflict and promote peace between states. Kant argued for the establishment of a peaceful world community, not in a sense of a global government, but in the hope that each state would declare itself a free state that respects its citizens and welcomes foreign visitors as fellow rational beings, thus promoting peaceful society worldwide. International cooperation to promote collective security originated in the Concert of Europe that developed after the Napoleonic Wars in the 19th century in an attempt to maintain the status quo between European states and so avoid war. This period also saw the development of international law, with the first Geneva Conventions establishing laws dealing with humanitarian relief during wartime, and the International Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 governing rules of war and the peaceful settlement of international disputes. The forerunner of the League of Nations, the Interparliamentary Union, was formed by the peace activists William Randall Cremer and Frederic Passy in 1889. The organization was international in scope, with a third of the members of parliament serving as members of the IPU by 1914. Its aims were to encourage governments to solve international disputes by peaceful means. Annual conferences were held to help governments refine the process of international arbitration. Its structure consisted of a council headed by a president, which would later be reflected in the structure of the League. At the start of the 20th century, two power blocs emerged from alliances between the European great powers. It was these alliances that, at the start of the First World War in 1914, drew all the major European powers into the conflict. This was the first major war in Europe between industrialized countries, and the first time in Western Europe that the results of industrialization had been dedicated to war. The result of this industrialized warfare, which provided modern weapons, coupled with outdated 19th-century strategies, led to an unprecedented casualty level: 8.5 million soldiers killed, an estimated 21 million wounded, and approximately 10 million civilian deaths. By the time the fighting ended in November 1918, the war had had a profound impact, affecting the social, political and economic systems of Europe and inflicting psychological and physical damage. Anti-war sentiment rose across the world. The First World War was described as the war to end all wars, and its possible causes were vigorously investigated. The causes identified included arms races, alliances, militaristic nationalism, secret diplomacy, and the freedom of sovereign states to enter into war for their own benefit. One proposed remedy was the creation of an international organization whose aim was to prevent future war through disarmament, open diplomacy, international cooperation, restrictions on the right to wage war, and penalties that made war unattractive. Initial proposals at the start of the First World War, the first schemes for international organization to prevent future wars began to gain considerable public support, particularly in the United Kingdom and the United States. Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson, a British political scientist, coined the term League of Nations in 1914 and drafted a scheme for its organization. Together with Lord Bryce, he played a leading role in the founding of the group of internationalist pacifists known as the Bryce Group, later the League of Nations Union. The group became steadily more influential among the public and as a pressure group within the then-governing Liberal Party. In Dickinson's 1915 pamphlet after the war, he wrote of his League of Peace as being essentially an organization for arbitration and conciliation. He felt that the secret diplomacy of the early 20th century had brought about war and thus could write that the impossibility of war, I believe, would be increased in proportion as the issues of foreign policy should be known to and controlled by public opinion. The proposals of the Bryce Group were circulated widely, both in England and the US, where they had a profound influence on the nascent international movement. In 1915, a similar body was set up in the United States by a group of like-minded individuals, including William Howard Taft. It was called the League to Enforce Peace and was substantially based on the proposals of the Bryce Group. It advocated the use of arbitration in conflict resolution and the imposition of sanctions on aggressive countries. However, none of these early organizations envisioned a continuously functioning body, with the exception of the Fabian Society in England. They maintained a legalistic approach that would limit the international body to a court of justice. The Fabians were the first to argue for a Council of States, necessarily the great powers, who would adjudicate world affairs, and for the creation of a permanent secretariat to enhance international cooperation across a range of activities. The British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour commissioned the first official report into the matter in early 1918. Under the initiative of Lord Robert Cecil, the British Committee was finally appointed in February 1918. It was led by Walter Phillimore, but also included Aircrow, William Tyrrell, and Cecil Hurst. The recommendations of the so-called Phillimore Commission included the establishment of a Conference of Allied States that would arbitrate disputes and impose sanctions on offending states. The proposals were approved by the British government, and much of the Commission's results were later incorporated into the Covenant of the League of Nations. The French also drafted a much more far-reaching proposal in June of that year. They advocated annual meetings of a council to settle all disputes, as well as an international army to enforce its decisions. The American President Woodrow Wilson instructed Edward M. House to draft a U.S. plan which reflected Wilson's own idealistic views, as well as the work of the Fillmore Commission. The outcome of House's work, and Wilson's own first draft, proposed the termination of unethical state behavior, including forms of espionage and dishonesty. Methods of compulsion against recalcitrant states would include severe measures, such as blockading and closing the frontiers of that power to commerce or intercourse with any part of the world, and to use any force that may be necessary. The two principal drafters and architects of the Covenant of the League of Nations were Lord Robert Cecil and Jan Smuts. Smuts' proposals included the creation of a Council of the Great Powers as permanent members and a non-permanent selection of the minor states. He also proposed the creation of a mandate system for captured colonies of the Central Powers during the war. Cecil focused on the administrative side, and proposed annual council meetings and quadrennial meetings for the assembly of all members. He also argued for a large and permanent secretariat to carry out the League's administrative duties. Establishment at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Wilson, Cecil, and Smuts all put forward the draft proposals. After lengthy negotiations between the delegates, the Hearst-Miller draft was finally produced as a basis for the Covenant. After more negotiation and compromise, the delegates finally approved of the proposal to create the League of Nations on the 25th of January 1919. The final Covenant of the League of Nations was drafted by a special commission, and the League was established by Part 1 of the Treaty of Versailles. On the 28th of June 1919, 44 states signed the Covenant, including 31 states which had taken part in the war on the side of the Triple Entente joined it during the conflict. The League would be made up of a General Assembly, an Executive Council, and a permanent Secretariat. Member states were expected to respect and preserve as against external aggression the territorial integrity of other members, and to disarm to the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. All states were required to submit complaints for arbitration, a judicial inquiry, before going to war. The Executive Council would create a permanent court of international justice to make judgments on the disputes. Despite Wilson's efforts to establish and promote the League, for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in October 1919, the United States did not join. Opposition in the Senate, particularly from two Republican politicians, Henry Cabot Lodge and William Borah, and especially in regard to Article 10 of the Covenant, ensured that the United States would not ratify the agreement. The League held its first council meeting in Paris on the 16th of January 1920, 6 days after the Versailles Treaty and the Covenant of the League of Nations came into force. On the 1st of November 1920, the headquarters of the League was moved from London to Geneva, where the First General Assembly was held on the 15th of November 1920. Languages and symbols. The official languages of the League of Nations were French, English, and Spanish. The League considered adopting Esperanto as the working language and actively encouraging its use, but this proposal was never acted on. In 1921, Lord Robert Cecil proposed the introduction of Esperanto into state schools of member nations, and a report was commissioned. When the report was presented 2 years later, it recommended the adoption of Cecil's idea, a proposal that 11 delegates accepted. The strongest opposition came from the French delegate Gabriel Hanotaux, partially to protect French, which he argued was already the international language. As a result of such opposition, the recommendation was not accepted. In 1939, a semi-official emblem for the League of Nations emerged, two five-pointed stars within a blue pentagon. They symbolized the Earth's 5 continents and 5 races. A bow at the top displayed the English name, while another at the bottom showed the French. Principal organs. The main constitutional organs of the League were the Assembly, the Council, and the Permanent Secretariat. It also had 2 essential wings, the Permanent Court of International Justice and the International Labour Organization. In addition, there were a number of auxiliary agencies and commissions. Each organ's budget was allocated by the Assembly. The relations between the Assembly and the Council and the competencies of each were for the most part not explicitly defined. Each body could deal with any matter within the sphere of competence of the League or affecting peace in the world. Particular questions or tasks might be referred to either. Unanimity was required for the decisions of both the Assembly and the Council, except in matters of procedure and some other specific cases such as the admission of new members. This requirement was a reflection of the League's belief in the sovereignty of its component nations. The League sought solution by consent, not by dictation. However, in case of a dispute, the consent of the parties to the dispute was not required for unanimity. The Permanent Secretariat, established at the seat of the League at Geneva, comprised a body of experts in various spheres under the direction of the General Secretary. Its principal sections were political, financial and economics, transit, minorities and administration, mandates, disarmament, health, social, intellectual cooperation and international bureau, legal, and information. The staff of the Secretariat was responsible for preparing the agenda for the Council and the Assembly and publishing reports of the meetings and other routine matters, effectively acting as the League's civil service. In 1931 the staff numbered 707. The Assembly consisted of representatives of all members of the League, with each state allowed up to 3 representatives and 1 vote. It met in Geneva and, after its initial sessions in 1920, it convened once a year in September. The special functions of the Assembly included the admission of new members, the periodical election of non-permanent members to the Council, the election with the Council of the judges of the Permanent Court, and control of the budget. In practice, the Assembly was the general directing force of League activities. The League Council acted as a type of executive body directing the Assembly's business. It began with 4 permanent members and 4 non-permanent members that were elected by the Assembly for a 3-year term. The first non-permanent members were Belgium, Brazil, Greece, and Spain. The composition of the Council was changed a number of times. The number of non-permanent members was first increased to 6 on the 22nd of September 1922 and to 9 on the 8th of September 1926. Werner Danquet of Germany pushed for his country to join the League, joining in 1926. Germany became the 5th permanent member of the Council. Later, after Germany and Japan both left the League, the number of non-permanent seats was increased from 9 to 11, and the Soviet Union was made a permanent member, giving the Council a total of 15 members. The Council met, on average, 5 times a year and in extraordinary sessions when required. In total, 107 sessions were held between 1920 and 1939. Other bodies. The League oversaw the Permanent Court of International Justice and several other agencies and commissions created to deal with pressing international problems. These included the Disarmament Commission, the Health Organization, the International Labour Organization, the Mandates Commission, the International Commission on Intellectual Cooperation, the Permanent Central Opium Board, the Commission for Refugees, and the Slavery Commission. 3 of these institutions were transferred to the United Nations after the Second World War: the International Labour Organization, the Permanent Court of International Justice, and the Health Organization. The Permanent Court of International Justice was provided for by the Covenant but not established by it. The Council and the Assembly established its constitution. Its judges were elected by the Council and the Assembly, and its budget was provided by the latter. The court was to hear and decide any international dispute which the parties concerned submitted to it. It might also give an advisory opinion on any dispute or question referred to it by the Council or the Assembly. The court was open to all the nations of the world under certain broad conditions. The International Labour Organization was created in 1919 on the basis of Part 13 of the Treaty of Versailles. The ILO, although having the same members as the League and being subject to the budget control of the Assembly, was an autonomous organization with its own governing body, its own General Conference and its own Secretariat. Its constitution differed from that of the League. Representation had been accorded not only to governments but also to representatives of employers and workers' organizations. Albert Thomas was its first director. The ILO successfully restricted the addition of lead to paint, and convinced several countries to adopt an 8-hour workday and 48-hour working week. It also campaigned to end child labor, increase the rights of women in the workplace, and make ship owners liable for accidents involving seamen. After the demise of the League, the ILO became an agency of the United Nations in 1946. The League's health organization had 3 bodies: the Health Bureau, containing permanent officials of the League, the General Advisory Council, a conference, an executive section consisting of medical experts, and the Health Committee. The committee's purpose was to conduct inquiries, oversee the operation of the League's health work, and prepare work to be presented to the Council. This body focused on ending leprosy, malaria, and yellow fever, the latter two by starting an international campaign to exterminate mosquitoes. The health organization also worked successfully with the government of the Soviet Union to prevent typhus epidemics, including organizing a large education campaign. The League of Nations had devoted serious attention to the question of international intellectual cooperation since its creation. The First Assembly in December 1920 recommended that the Council take action aiming at the international organization of intellectual work, which it did by adopting a report presented by the Fifth Committee of the Second Assembly and inviting a Committee on Intellectual Cooperation to meet in Geneva in August 1922. The French philosopher Henri Bergson became the first chairman of the committee. The work of the committee included inquiry into the conditions of intellectual life, assistance to countries where intellectual life was in danger, creation of national committees for intellectual cooperation, cooperation with international intellectual organizations, protection of intellectual property, inter-university cooperation, coordination of bibliographical work and international interchange of publications, and international cooperation in archaeological research, introduced by the Second International Opium Convention. The Permanent Central Opium Board had to supervise the statistical reports on trade in opium, morphine, cocaine and heroin. The board also established a system of import certificates and export authorizations for the legal international trade in narcotics. The Slavery Commission sought to eradicate slavery and slave trading across the world, and fought forced prostitution. Its main success was through pressing the governments who administered mandated countries to end slavery in those countries. The League secured a commitment from Ethiopia to end slavery as a condition of membership in 1923, and worked with Liberia to abolish forced labor and intertribal slavery. The United Kingdom had not supported Ethiopian membership of the League on the grounds that Ethiopia had not reached a state of civilization and internal security sufficient to warrant her admission. The League also succeeded in reducing the death rate of workers constructing the Tanganyika Railway from 55 to 4%. Records were kept to control slavery, prostitution, and the trafficking of women and children, partly as a result of pressure brought by the League of Nations. Afghanistan abolished slavery in 1923, Iraq in 1924, Nepal in 1926, Transjordan and Persia in 1929, Bahrain in 1937, and Ethiopia in 1942. Led by Fridtjof Nansen, the Commission for Refugees was established on 27 June 1921 to look after the interests of refugees, including overseeing the repatriation and, when necessary, resettlement. At the end of the First World War, there were 2 to 3 million ex-prisoners of war from various nations dispersed throughout Russia. Within 2 years of the Commission's foundation, it had helped 425,000 of them return home. It established camps in Turkey in 1922 to aid the country with an ongoing refugee crisis, helping to prevent disease and hunger. It also established the Nansen passport as a means of identification for stateless people. The Committee for the Study of the Legal Status of Women sought to inquire into the status of women all over the world. It was formed in 1937, and later became part of the United Nations as the Commission on the Status of Women. Members of the League's 42 founding members, 23 remained members until it was dissolved in 1946. In the founding year, 6 other states joined, only 2 of which remained members throughout the League's existence. An additional 15 countries joined later. The largest number of member states was 58 between the 28th of September 1934 and the 23rd of February 1935. The Soviet Union became a member on the 18th of September 1934 and was expelled on the 14th of December 1939 for invading Finland. In expelling the Soviet Union, the League broke its own rule. Only 7 of 15 members of the Council voted for expulsion, short of the majority required by the Covenant. 3 of these members had been made Council members the day before the vote. This was one of the League's final acts before it practically ceased functioning due to the Second World War. On the 26th of May 1937, Egypt became the last state to join the League. The first member to withdraw permanently from the League was Costa Rica on the 22nd of January 1925, having joined on the 16th of December 1920. This also makes it the member to have most quickly withdrawn. Brazil was the first founding member to withdraw, and Haiti the last. Iraq, which joined in 1932, was the first member that had previously been a League of Nations mandate.